Okay, thank you. Good morning. This is Methods in Complex Systems, which you all know that. So, and you all know who I am, which is Dr. Larry Liebovitch. And this is going to be Methods in Complex Systems, ISC 6930. Maybe I'll write this down just so we have it on the machine. So if you could switch to the Elmo for a moment. Great, thanks. So this is me. I almost wrote me, but I restrained myself. And we're in Methods in Complex Systems. And we're this. And we're sequence number 4308S, and it's spring 1998. Okay, so that it orients us. We're going to be meeting where you are, which is here. So you are here. Actually, I was at a place on Wednesday where there was a little sign and there was supposed to be a map, but the map wasn't there. There was just a little sign that says, "You are here." And it was true. And that would be true no matter where the sign was. My office, in case you need to see me, is over here in building T8. So if this is where we are now. Hi, Bill. If you'll pick up oh, you have a syllabus, but you could pick up another one. And we just started. So we're here, and if you want, this is the breezeway down through here, and this is the Science and Engineering Building, and this is PBCC, and this is Building T8 where my office is. And if you need to get in touch with me, my telephone number is, so my office is in building T8, and my number is 297-2239. And if you need to get in touch with me, please call. Don't email. No email. Because I get too much email and I can't deal with it. So emailing to me is not a useful or productive thing to do. And I have office hours listed, but if you want to get in touch with me, the best thing to do is just call, because I can meet people at a time that's mutually convenient, and that's the best thing to do. So what I'm going to do today is just give you an introduction to the course and go over some material. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what I think science is, and give you an overview of everything about science. And then maybe we'll leave some time at the end of that for you to tell me that what you thought I said was complete nonsense. So we'll have some time for feedback from that too. First of all, let me go over the books in the course. So there's really only one required book, which is this one, which is Sham's Statistics, and it's gone through a second edition. I have the first edition. I don't like this sort of stuff because if I have the first edition, I go through a second one, it just makes me feel old. But this time I broke down and bought the second edition. And I think this is really an excellent book, and we're going to be using this extensively. And it has a lot of explanations of things and a lot of problems, including solutions worked out to the problems. And I think it's really an excellent it's an excellent book, and I think it's very helpful. And it's a good resource if you're doing statistics later. Come in first at the music stand, turn right at the music stand, and take a syllabus. And somewhere floating around there should also be a attendance sheet, which you should sign when it floats near you. And you can see it's floating right now in real time. Okay. All I've said so far is that you know what class you're in. The only thing I've said so far is that if you want to get in touch with me, please do not email, because I get too many emails. So if you want to reach me, you should just call. So if you need additional information about anything that you think I can answer, just call. And I was just saying that the textbook in the course, the only required textbook is this Sham Statistics outline book, which is an excellent book and describes statistics and has problems with worked examples and then additional problems. And I think this is really an excellent book and is useful to have if you ever want to look up something on statistics. Now, there are two unrequired books which are recommended. The first is this book by Hollander and Wolf, which is called Non-Parametric Statistical Methods. And I think this is an excellent book on non-parametric methods. We'll see that parametric method means we can characterize the statistics, the distribution, by parameters. And the most used one is the Gaussian distribution, or a normal or a bell curve. And we'll see there are other sort of forms that data have that are not like that. And those can be handled better by non-parametric tests. And I think this is the best book I've seen on non-parametric tests, and we'll discuss those in this class a little bit too. Lastly, I've also put down as unrequired my book, which is called Fractals and Chaos Simplified for the Life Sciences. And in the back here, there's a little description of the book, of which my favorite word is lucidly. Lucidly, I like that word, although I can't focus it. So my book is here too. What I'm going to be doing in this course is maybe I'll explain now instead of in a minute. This course is required for the PhD in Complex Systems in Brain Science. And the idea is that many of you have had a statistics course in a different way, and either you remembered everything and you don't need to be here at all, or you had the statistics course and you forgot everything that was in it, which is also possible, or you had some statistics, or even if you had statistics and knew everything, there are lots of things they didn't tell you. And what I'm going to do here is tell you some of the stuff that they didn't tell you. Now, some of the stuff they didn't tell you is not that they didn't tell you because it was so difficult or so hard, but because they didn't make clear what are the underlying assumptions in handling some of the statistics. So what I want to do here is to kind of bring everyone in the center program up to at least a workable level, or at least the same level, in terms of understanding the statistics. And as I said, what I'm going to do here, which may be different from whatever course you've had before, is really to emphasize the assumptions that go into the usual statistics that are used. And the odds are they didn't tell you this in the other courses you've had, or they didn't make it clear enough. And what I'm going to do is to go into these situations where I really describe what the assumptions are of these methods are. We'll see, as I said, we have these first parametric methods, which I'll describe. And then when the assumptions of the parametric methods fail, we'll have non-parametric methods. And we'll see that there are cases of real data where both of these methods actually fail, and we'll need to get a little bit into distributions that are fractal or have other properties. So I'm also going to, when I know the material well enough, describe a little bit some of the historical development of these things so you can better see where they come from and what the hidden assumptions are. So this course will still be different from whatever statistics course you've had before. In the sense, I'm going to really make an effort to deal with these underlying assumptions of things. And I also want to give you a little bit of a discussion in this course about actually how to do science. So there's going to be some discussion. Today it's going to be more about the philosophy of science. I was going to use another word here, but I haven't, but I'm not. We'll also discuss a little bit about experimental design and analyzing the data and then interpreting it. So the course will also cover a little bit on how we use these statistics in real-life science and how we go about doing science and how we design experiments and analyze and interpret the results. So that's what the purpose of the course is. And I have a little section here of course policies, which I will read once in a monotone voice, which is that students are expected to attend all scheduled classes. Should it become necessary for a student to miss a class, the student is responsible for the material covered during that class. It is the responsibility of the student to withdraw from this class should that status be desired. The instructor, me, cannot withdraw students from the course. The instructor, me, will not give the grade of I instead of a grade of D or F. The grade of I will be considered only in exceptional cases, such as serious illness, for the student who is presently performing at a C or higher level in the course. Next it says, reading the textbook, please read the chapters assigned prior to the class section in which the material is presented, because I think it will make it easier for you to understand things. I find I need to be told everything 3 times before I get it. So, but here, I figure you're smarter than I am. You only need it twice, so you'll get it once from me and once from the book. And that should be enough. So in light of that, let me give you an assignment for next time. Which is in the Shams book. Let's do it this way. So in that book, the Spiegel's book, which is the only book I'll give assignments from, for next time, please, see it's all capitalized just like in the syllabus, read chapters 2 to 4. And that will be a discussion of the underlying properties of statistical distributions, which I'll talk about next time. Now, in terms of homework, it says, please turn in the homework problems on time. None will be accepted after the last meeting of the class, and the grade will be entirely determined from the homework problems. So there'll be no test, and the entire grade will be determined from the homework problems. Next on your syllabus is a tentative schedule of lectures. Tentative is a technical word meaning I have absolutely no intention whatsoever of meeting this schedule. But it's actually pretty accurate in the order of things. What will probably happen is we'll have more questions on some of the material, so things will be squashed a little bit later. So that's why it's listed as tentative. So the order is the same. What I'm going to do is threatened today is to talk about what science is. Then after that, I'll discuss next lecture, why do we measure things more than once? And there's a whole point of doing statistics, and the whole way we handle things in science is we do an experiment many times and take the data and do something with that data together. And no one would have done this 200 years ago. People would have thought this was crazy 200 years ago. Why would you do the experiment bad 5 times and average the data together? You should get the best person and do the experiment carefully once and get the right answer. And the idea as to why we do the statistics in the first place is, I think, one of the things that's covered poorest in a standard statistics course. So I'm going to spend a lot of time to try to describe why we do that and try to make that really clear. And also try to make it clear what are the assumptions that underlie what we do. And we're going to see cases where those assumptions fail and we have to handle data in a different way. So I'm going to make that explicitly clear. Then I'll describe how we can characterize data using moments like mean and variance. Then I'll describe how we can fit mathematical relationships to data using things that you've heard about like least squares, and I'll tell the story of least squares, the history of least squares, and the controversy involving the history of least squares. But I'll also describe other methods of fitting data that you've never heard of, like the Hodgson-Lehmann estimator, which is a non-parametric method of fitting data. Then I'll describe a little bit about designing experiments and controls in blind and double-blind experiments. And then about statistical tests, parametric Gaussian tests like using Z's and T's and F's. We'll talk a little bit about the student t-test. Does anyone here know what student's real name was? Like, this is the important thing you learn in this class, things like this. Student is a pseudonym because he worked for a company and he didn't want the company to know that he was developing these statistical tests or that he was publishing the results. So his name is really William Gossett, and the company he worked for was Guinness. So he developed these tests on brewing beer. That's where the tests come from. And he had small samples of beer that he was brewing. And they weren't quite Gaussian because there was a small amount of data in each sample. So he developed a statistical test on the assembly line to test the quality of different operations in brewing the beer. So that's the sort of thing you'll learn in this class, which you probably didn't have in your other statistics class. Then we'll see how we can do the same thing using non-parametric tests like rank order and Hodgson-Lehmann tests. We'll do a little bit about analysis of variance, which everybody else into psychology is into, which I have never used. And you'll hear me say why I think analysis of variance is not a good idea. But I'll explain it to you in great depth so you can do it, and then everyone will be happy, so no one will be mad at me that I haven't told you how to do analysis of variance. Then we'll describe cases where all of these ideas fail, including fractals and chaos. And depending on how much time we spend in the first part, will determine how much time we spend on fractals and chaos. I have 4 lectures on fractals and chaos listed here. I think last time I gave this course, we wound up doing 2 lectures on it. But as far as the elementary material, we'll at least cover basically all the material in my book, probably in those 2 lectures, although fast. But we will probably do that. Okay, that's this page. Does anyone have any questions on the syllabus of what we're going to be doing? Okay, so let me start. What I'm going to do is describe a little bit about what science is, because I think it's worth doing that, because we never do that explicitly. So the basic point about science is that in science, we ask nature. We don't tell her. This is a line from an Italian astronomer. And I think this is basically the underlying principle of what science is. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what this means and the consequences of this. That in other disciplines, in one way or another, we're either told what to believe by authority or custom, or there are certain rules by which we come to believe things. And science is different. That in science, it's not a question of what we believe, but somehow how we interact with nature, and then we expect to learn from nature the way things are. So we may have some assumptions or some ideas of how things are in nature, but the point of doing science is not to tell nature, but to learn from nature how things are. And this is really very different than a lot of other disciplines we have in life, where we have rules or customs, and those determine what goes on. Here, in a certain sense, it's not what we believe, but what we think nature is trying to tell us. And I think this has 2 very important implications about science and how science is done. The first one is that if each of us is asking science and asking nature about how nature is, it means that different people can read nature differently and come up with different answers. I think there's a sense from people who are not in science of never understanding why scientists can't tell them, whether there's going to be global warming or whether Tylenol is bad for them or things like that. And I think that is a misunderstanding of how science works, that there's not necessarily one scientific answer, and these people can't understand why scientists disagree. But if each of us are asking nature, then each of us might arrive at a different answer. This doesn't mean that all those different answers are right. We like to think that by looking at the data, we can tell which is the right answer, but sometimes that isn't so easy. So it means that we can have different answers. The second aspect of this is that the things that are doing this, that are asking nature, are people. People have a lot of characteristics that are both good and bad. So science isn't some cold, irrational thing that's done. It's something that's done by people. And people can also believe in authority and be narrow-minded and stuck in certain ways of looking that I'll describe a little bit later, which are called paradigms. And people can also be arrogant and petty. And people can also be fun and interesting and inquisitive about things. And this means that a lot of what goes on in science and how we understand the world involves the qualities that real people have and how they handle things. And both all the good things and the bad things about people influence what goes on in science and how we learn about the world. And I think it's very important to realize this, that science isn't something divorced from how people handle other things in their life. I was at a meeting in California once, actually in Marina del Rey, where someone explained why he did science. In fact, it was Larry Stark, who's at Berkeley, who's done a lot of work on the visual system and other things, and has done very, very creative work over a long career. And he said he does science because it's like being in kindergarten your whole life, that you get to play and explore and learn about the world. And he does science because it's fun. Someone else at this meeting said he was a surgeon and he was doing his work not to learn about the world, but what he was doing was helping people, and he knew that was important to do that. And Larry Stark became very upset with that because he thought that science doesn't have a purpose, that people do science because it's fun, not because we're trying to cure diseases in the world, or not because we're necessarily producing things that are useful for people or economically useful, even though in the long run that is what science does, and it's very important for that. But that the purpose of science is to have fun and to learn about the world. In a poem by I.A. Richards, who was one of a group of British poets that surrounded W.H. Auden in the 50s and 60s, and even earlier in England, there's a poem where Richards says that birds fly not only because they can get food and escape from predators, but it's something they can do and they enjoy it. And he said that's the way people write poetry, because it's something they can do and enjoy. And that's partly why people do science, that being curious and intelligent is an attribute that people have, and exercising that attribute is fun. And I think it's worth saying this because sometimes we emphasize too much that science in the long run leads to good economic values and products and things and helps people. But I think the reason why most people and I do science is because it's fun, and it's fun to explore and be curious about the world. And I think it's worth saying that explicitly. Now, how do we do science? Well, I have a textbook that we use in this undergraduate course that explains science to undergraduate psychology students. And the textbook sort of has a list of things that people do when they do science. It says that you start with an idea, that you then review the literature, that you then develop a testable hypothesis, all right, testable after here to make the call proper people feel happy. We do a pilot experiment, then we design a real experiment, then we do the real experiment, and from this we get data, which we then analyze, and this will include the statistics that we do here, and we interpret it, and we publish it. And maybe someone else reads what we publish. Well, this is the usual idea of how science is described. Now, I think this is actually a pretty poor representation of how science is really done. Okay? Some of the things that are wrong with this are, first of all, the way science is really done is, at least the way I started off, is sometimes you get your own idea what you do things, but usually you work for someone and they tell you what to do. So you have some advisor. Now this isn't necessarily bad. It means in a certain way we have more of an apprentice system here than the system of taking courses and going out by doing things. You learn by doing with someone. How do you spell apprentice? With an E or an A? A. SC. Thank you. You will see here, if you haven't had a course with me already, that I have good spelling days and bad spelling days. And today is sort of medium right now. It could get worse, it could get better. We'll see what happens. So this is the way science really starts off, or at least the way it started off for me. And it'll probably start off for most of you too. So it's not that you just have ideas. Usually if you have a student that has really good ideas, you start off by letting them do their ideas sooner. Because the last thing you want to do is tell someone who's really good what to do. The next thing that happens, and I don't know what percentage of science this happens to, but it's whatever percentages it's too big, is that I know lots of scientists that spend their entire scientific career redoing their PhD thesis. And they basically do the same thing over and over again for their entire scientific career. And I don't think this is always very healthy. Sometimes it is because they discover a lot of stuff, but it's a little bit scary. Now I think the way that best describes to me how science is done, or a lot of science, is a story that I once told someone, and she thought it was the most pessimistic story she's ever heard. But I don't think it's so pessimistic. I think it's actually an optimistic story. And it's a story that goes back to one of the early quantum mechanics people. And the story is this guy comes along late at night, and there's a light post, a street light, and it's shining down on the street. And in front of the light, there's a guy looking for something in front of the light, under the light post. And the guy is not in very good shape. It looks like he's drunk. And he's looking for, and the guy watches him for a little bit. And then figures, well, maybe he can help him a little bit. So he asks him, well, what are you looking for? And the guy said he's looking for his keys that he dropped. So the guy helps him a little bit, and they look around the light for a while. And they're not making any progress. They're not finding the keys. So the guy asks them, well, maybe we can narrow the search. Where do you think you dropped the keys? And the guy points across the street, all the way across the street where it's dark. And he says, that's over there. That's where I think I dropped the keys. And the guy's sort of astounded. So he says, well, then why are you looking over here? And he said, because this is where the light is. And in a certain way, this sounds like a pretty pessimistic story. But in other ways, it's not. This is how I think most of science is really done. That is, we can't study things like consciousness or thinking. So what do? We study different neural connections in a pleasure. Or instead of studying memory, we study long-term potentiation. Okay? So most of science consists of not being able to study the things we really want to study, but we manage to keep ourselves busy studying something that's at least interesting. And very often in the process of studying something that's at least interesting, we can discover much more interesting things that come upon that we wouldn't have picked up otherwise. So I think actually a lot of science is done because we have tools to do things. And I'll emphasize later on in the lecture today that a lot of what we think of the world is really a result of the particular tools we have. I've been reading, actually, for the first time, Marshall McLuhan's book called Understanding Media, which came out in 1964. And he has this wonderful line in there that says, we shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. And a lot of how we see about the world is relevant to the experimental tools that we have. If we have only one electrode, we're going to measure oscillations in time, because that's all we can do with one electrode. And if we have arrays of electrodes, we may think of the brain very differently. So I think a lot of what we really do in working with a lot of systems is really determined by the tools we have and what we can do with it. And in a way that really traps us, but in a way we also discover other things we wouldn't expect. And I think a lot of science is really like this. We're never studying what we really want to study, but we can study something that will lead to useful results. Now let me say something negative about other things in this list too. One of the things that's always emphasized in this list, or one of the things that's always included in this list, is reviewing the literature. In fact, this is good and this is bad. The real history of science is that very often major ideas don't come from people doing the same old crap over and over again. They come from new people getting into a field with new approaches. And very often reading all the same old crap that everybody else does rots your mind, and you think in the same ways instead of doing something new. In psychology, a major change happened about 150 years ago where a bunch of these people, and very often in these stories, these are the good people, but not always, these physicists, got into psychology and decided a lot of psychology they thought was not well enough defined. So what they were going to do was measure things, measure all the stimuli and relate those to responses, and started a field called psychophysics, which doesn't mean psychotic physicists, but means using methods of measurement to try to see what they could measure in terms of stimulus and response. And this really changed psychology forever and at least created one branch of psychology. Now, these people didn't go into psychology and read everything they could about psychology. They had a different perspective, and they got in. And this happens in many other fields, too. I've been told, for example, that in engineering, a lot of engineering firms like to hire nice young college graduate engineers right out of school because they have no experience. So if you give them a problem, they don't know what they can't do. And very often they sit down and come up with something that the senior engineers wouldn't have thought of because they would think that it's too difficult to design or something. So first of all, the idea that you should necessarily start on a problem by seeing everything that everybody else did is not necessarily true. On the other hand, it's always useful to have information, and if you know nothing about what people did, or not enough, and these people do that a lot, these physicists in discussing biology, where they say very silly things because they don't understand enough about the biology. And so I'm not advocating not knowing what you're talking about. It's always useful to know what you're talking about. But I'm just saying this idea that you always start by the same path that everybody else did is not necessarily a good idea. As I said, I'm presenting a very personal sense of what my view of science is, and I'll give at least some equal time at the end if anyone wants to rebut it, or if someone wants to rebut it while I'm going along, they can do that too. So I think it is not necessarily true that advances in science come from within a discipline, that sometimes they come from outside. And I'll write down here my favorite quotation, which you've probably at least heard me say once before anyhow, but I'll write it down here anyhow, which is from the social psychologist Abraham Maslow, which is, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to treat everything as if it were a nail. And this is from Abraham Maslow, who was in Brooklyn and in Boston and a bunch of other places. And what I want to, and we'll see this in a very practical way in this course, where we start off with parametric statistics and go to non-parametric statistics and then go to statistics that cannot be characterized by means and variances and moments. So we'll see as we expand the different tools, we have a wider range of experimental data that we can test. Now, what I'd like to do is to give you a little bit more information on science. And this is not from me, but this is from a group which is called, this is the most prestigious official group of scientists in the United States, called the National Academy of Science. So this is not me now. This is the most official group of people you can think of. Yeah? National Academy. All right. All right. So this shows that different functions really are localized in the brain, and you can write and talk and not have them correlated. Thanks. And I brought copies of this article with me. So if they're not enough for everyone, so if anyone wants to borrow them, you can borrow them and then either return it to me or return it to someone else. And I think this is a really nice description of what science is. And this is a piece which is called On Being a Scientist. And this is currently out of print. They have another booklet about fraud in science, which is in print. But this book, On Being a Scientist, is out of print. so we can make copies. And this is from the Committee on the Conduct of Science from the National Academy of Sciences. And I'd like to read a little bit of some of the stuff in here to give you a feel for what these people think science is like. It says here, scientific knowledge emerges from a process that is intensely human, a process marked by its full share of human virtues and limitations. How is this limited, fallible work of individual scientists converted into the enduring edifice of scientific knowledge? Many people think of scientific research as a routine cut-and-dried process. They associate the nature of scientific knowledge with the process of deriving it and conclude that research is as objective and unambiguous as scientific results. The reality is much different. Researchers continually have to make difficult decisions about how to do their work and how to present that work to others. Scientists have a large body of knowledge that they can use in making these decisions. Yet much of this knowledge is not the product of scientific investigation, but instead involves value-laden judgments, personal desires, and even a researcher's personality and style. Later on, they go on to quote Peter Medawar, a very well-known British scientist, saying, and I quote, "Scientists are people of very dissimilar temperaments, doing different things in different ways. Among scientists are collectors, classifiers, and compulsive tidiers up. Many are detectives by temperament, and many are explorers. Some are artists, and others artisans. There are poet scientists and philosopher scientists and even a few mystics." So it's not that there's one thing that's science, that people have very different attitudes in how they handle science and different approaches. And we'll see science as a social process and a social system, where if you come up with something, other people are going to test it and see whether it's right or wrong. But different people play different roles in this process. Some people are very visionary, but are not too careful at doing experiments. And other people may be more careful at doing experiments or theory, but may have less vision. And there's a mixture of these different people, and different people fulfill different roles within this whole coherent, or at least global, social enterprise. One of the examples they give of that is in here, is the discovery of the charge on the electron. Let me pull out a little bit here. That is, there is an electric charge on the electron. And one of the questions that came up toward the beginning of the century was does this electric charge come in continuous or discrete units? That is it quantized? And they give, in this report, they give examples of two people who investigated this matter in around 1912. The first one was a very famous physicist, or a physicist who was very good at doing measurements, and was famous in science for that, named Robert Millikan. And first of all, this is a real copy of Millikan's lab notes. Now, the first thing I want you to understand is that if anyone turns in any homework that looks like this to me, this is like failing homework, okay? So this is not good, okay? But this is the real stuff. This is really what Millikan wrote down, okay? So the first thing you learn from this is that the rules that we make you do in school are not necessarily how things work in real life. Although it's really better to be neat, because although I do have actually some things that were written on a brown paper towel doing some experiments actually on some epithelia. But it's very neatly pasted into a piece of paper, which is in a 3-ring binder. If you ever do get a job at a chemical company or an industry, it actually is necessary to write in a lab book that has a carbon in it and produces a double copy of everything. And you have to sign that at the end of every day, or at least at every page. So under certain industrial circumstances, you really do have to write things that people can read, and this would be hopelessly not useful. But I think it will not be acceptable even for homework assignments in this class. But I wanted to show you this because this is what real science really looks like, okay, as opposed to the lab reports you have to write up in the homework from me. Now, the reason why they go into this experiment from Millikan, so I write Bob Millikan's name down, Robert Millikan. is that Millikan did this experiment. Oh, sorry. Millikan did this experiment, and he didn't like some of the data. And Millikan is one of the best physicists of all time in doing experiments. Okay? And sometimes he did the experiment, he just didn't like the data. So he chose some data to analyze. Now, Millikan's result from this was that the charge on the electron was quantized, that it did come in discrete units. And in fact, he was able to measure what amount of that charge was. And although I don't have the number in front of me, he got a number that's actually pretty accurate. Now, another guy did the same experiment. This is a guy named Felix Ehrenhoft. Now, Felix did what they told you in all your classes to do, which is don't choose data because you'll just fool yourself. All right? And so he used all his data from the experiments. And he got the answer that the charge was not quantized. So the deal here is that if you do everything you're supposed to do, which is not overly choose the data, you can get the wrong result. Now, this guy, Robert Millikan, who was more careful and somehow had a greater intuition in doing the experiment, got the right qualitative answer and got the right quantitative answer. Now, the deal here is that if I did something like this, if I did routinely what Millikan did, I would get the wrong answers. And if you did that, you would probably get the wrong answers, because if you have an idea of how an experiment is going to turn out, and you only choose values that agree with you, you're just going to fool yourself. On the other hand, this guy was one of the most brilliant experimental physicists of all time, and he knew how to do experiments, and so he used them to get the right answer, or he used his own knowledge to get the right answer. The point of this story, the reason why they tell this story, it's not so simple that you throw away data, you don't throw away data, that there's a tremendous feel and intuition and experience you get in how you handle data. And you have to learn how to do those things. And it's not simple. And you can certainly fool yourself. The last thing that you want to do is to fool yourself. And it's very easy to do that. It's very easy to ignore data that disagrees with a hypothesis that you have. On the other hand, you just don't blindly accept all the data. When I was at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York on the 21st floor, someone came down from the 22nd floor, and they were measuring the intraocular pressure in the eyes of rabbits. So you push on the cornea, and this machine, depending how hard it is to push on the eye, tells you what the pressure in the eye is. And this guy came down, and he had been measuring, and they do this to people. When you sit in the ophthalmologist, and it goes in, there's usually a puff of air. It's usually done by a puff of air. Sometimes it's done with a little lucite thing pushing on the cornea to flatten it out. So when you're sitting in that chair with, as long as I don't lose my tongue, sitting in that chair where they're holding you like that, and the thing is pressing on you, it's measuring the pressure inside the eye. And this guy had like 3 measurements. I don't remember exactly what they were, but there was something like this in millimeters of mercury. And this was like the same measurements on the same rabbit. And he came down to me because he heard I knew something about statistics, and he wanted to he wanted to know whether basically he had some mathematical excuse to throw this number away. And basically, if you believe in Gaussian statistics, which we'll start off with in this class, then you need this number. I mean, you can't throw numbers away, right? All numbers count, right? You just can't throw a number away. If you're looking for the average of this, you have no right to throw any number away. But what any real scientist would do would be to say, you must have messed up this measurement. It's just never going to be that way, and you throw that number away. And how we make these decisions are very delicate, because if we throw all the numbers away that disagree with us, we can prove anything, and we're really bad scientists. So how we make these decisions and how we approach data involves a lot of these things which are much harder for me to explain to you, and which depend on what you think your own skill is in the experiment. I would say when I think I have less skill in an experiment, I'm much less likely to throw away data, because I have less of a sense of wanting to fool myself. Now, A number of years ago, there was an article which I unfortunately read, or was fortunate to read, but unfortunate to save, where they went back through actually 4 famous experiments in the history of physics and chose and reanalyzed the original data, where now we have the real values. For example, experiments done around 1910 on the speed of light, where now we know the speed of light much better. And they had the original data, in this case it was from Michelson, who was again one of the greatest measurement physicists of all time. And they reanalyzed the data to see what's the best way to handle it to get the best result. And it actually turned out, and I'll discuss this next time or the time after, in terms of weighting to get measures of central tendency. It turned out that the mean weights outliers like this too much. And the best way, actually, of getting the correct value was actually throwing a few bad numbers and taking the arithmetic mean. So what many scientists do by intuition, actually they found quantitatively was actually the best way to handle the data. But we'll discuss under what circumstances you can do this and what you can't. Again, I want to emphasize that doing anything like this is very dangerous. And I rarely do this, but sometimes you do. If you get a result that is really crazy, you don't want to use it. And how we make these decisions are crucial and are even more important in how we handle a statistical test, because it's going to tell us what data we decide to do the tests on. So the only point I'm making from this, that they're making, the most prestigious group of scientists in the US is making, is that how we make these decisions are not as cut and dried as some textbooks would make it go out. And this report also discusses a number of other issues in science. For example, you know, if you and the head of your lab makes a discovery whose name goes on the paper and a bunch of other things like that. And they discuss some of those issues in science too, which I think are interesting issues. Overall, this whole article deals with a lot of stuff that I don't agree with, or some stuff that I don't agree with. They're very much into who published first, and therefore whose discovery belongs to someone. And I'm not into that. I don't think you own a piece of nature because your name is on the first article that it came out with. And they're very much into, if you publish something 1 month before someone else, then you deserve all the credit and the other person doesn't count. And I don't think it kind of works that way. In fact, to place this in a much broader historical perspective, a lot of our views on credit in science go back to the Renaissance. A lot of people think that the Middle Ages were bad and the Renaissance was uniformly good. A lot of bad things happened in the Renaissance. And one of it was a sense of arrogance. That in the Middle Ages, for example, nature didn't belong to people, it belonged to God. And for example, if you read a medieval bestiary, a description of animals from the Middle Ages, there will be like a description of a whale. And it will start off with a realistic description, or at least as good as they could make it, which is usually not very good, of a whale. And then the second half of the discussion of the whale will be the allegorical meaning of the whale. That the whale is have a large mouth like the devil and will try to encase you in sin or something. And to them, this physical description was just as important as the metaphorical description. If you're familiar with medieval manuscripts, for example, it's very common to have what's called an illuminated manuscript. So you'll see, for example, the first letter will be very big, you know, in doing something. But this is called an illumination, meaning shedding light on something. And it's not that this letter is big, but it will be filled with pictures which represent the meaning of the text. Okay? So it's not just that it's big, but it's done with art that represents the meaning of what's contained in the text. What happened in the Renaissance is that suddenly man became more important, and nature belonged not to God anymore, but to man. So one of the things that happened, I was told this story by a historian of science at Harvard, which is when the Renaissance hit, there was suddenly, before the Renaissance, if you copied something from someone, from a book or what someone else did, if what you copied was correct, it was okay. And if it wasn't correct, it wasn't okay. But you didn't have to quote them because you weren't stealing from them. They didn't own things. But when the Renaissance hit, suddenly there were huge cheating scandals at Oxford and Cambridge because now if you copied from someone, you stole from something. So suddenly nature belonged to people. And in fact, a lot of the problems we have in tracing historical things as to which Greek author did what, for example, is that we don't have a lot of the original works of these ancient Greeks, and they were recopied in the Middle Ages. And people weren't careful about who was attributed to what, because they weren't into that. So we don't know exactly what Archimedes did, or what Hipparchus did, or what a bunch of other people did. Because in the Middle Ages, when people copied those texts, they didn't care where they copied it from so much. So this idea that nature belongs to people, and it's important which person discovered something, comes out of the arrogance of the Italian Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance was very much into who did what, and a tremendous sense of ego. And that carries over in some ways in how we view science today. And I think that's, as I said, it hasn't always been that way 1,000 years ago. It wasn't important who did what. It was important whether it was true or not, or what its meaning was. So this National Academy, which consists of very important people who know they're very important, you know, who did what is a big deal to them. So that aspect of that article, I'm not thrilled with. But I think it's a wonderful thing to read, and I'd really encourage you to borrow it and read it, to see what top scientists say about what science really is. And it's a very different picture than typical textbooks paint of it. What I'd like to do now is to describe 3 different legs that science stands on to give you a sense of how we approach different things. And I'm going to discuss 3 things here: observations, experiments, and theory. Now, mostly in psychology, they're really into experiments, and secondarily into observations and less into theory. I think people here in complex systems are much more into theory and understand the importance of theory than in a usual psychology class. But people are still kind of down on observations a little bit, and I want to discuss a little bit of the importance of observations. Now, sometimes in life, in order to describe something, things that are really important to describe are so important that we just can't say them. You can't give a definition of something because something is so deep that just by giving the definition, you wouldn't understand what the definition is. You kind of have to live out the example of what something is. There's a wonderful line in a poem by Adrienne Rich, which is, "I couldn't tell you I love you unless you already knew it was true." And a lot of human relationships are like that, and a lot of things in nature are like that. That it's very hard to give a formal definition, that by seeing how something is and understanding it, then you can understand about it, but it's hard to give a formal definition. So what I'd like to do is therefore give an indirect approach to describing what the importance of observations are. And so I'll do this by telling a story, because if I can't do it directly, I'll do it by telling a story. So let me now tell you the story to lead in or to help explain what observations are about. And this is a story that in some ways goes back, in its main form, goes back to William Herschel, an astronomer of the last century, with additions by Ken Brescher, who's an astronomer, modern astronomer in Massachusetts. So let me tell you the story. Once upon a time, many, many years ago, in a land far, far away, there lived a king's daughter who wanted to be a movie actress, 2 teams of philosophers that the king had kept their entire lives locked up in ivory towers, and a dwarf that lived in the woods. One day, the king summoned the philosophers from their ivory towers, and he told them he was going to let them loose in these woods, which were outside the castle. And they had never seen the woods, because there are no windows in the ivory towers. And he said he was going to give them 1 day to look at the woods. And he wanted the philosophers to tell him if the woods were changing, and if the woods were changing, how the woods were changing in their 1 day of observation. Okay. So there were 2 teams of philosophers. The first team went into the woods, and they observed everything in the woods very, very carefully as they could. They looked at the leaves and the trees, and they watched everything very carefully. Some of them even did some measurements, and they saw that the measurements weren't changing as a function of time. And there's a syllabus in the back of the room if you're in the right place. These measurements weren't changing in time. And so what they concluded was, after this 1 day, since they didn't see anything change, that either nothing was changing in the forest, or that things were changing so slowly they couldn't detect what the changes were. So that's pretty clever if you think about it. They didn't say nothing was changing. Maybe things are changing so slowly that they couldn't see them. Okay, so that was what the first team of philosophers did. Now the second team. So these are the good guys, the second team. The second team, what they did, these were the natural philosophers. So what they did is they measured everything they could in the woods. They measured the heights of the trees. They measured the diameters of the trees. There were bushes. And one of the things they did is they made a graph of some of these measurements. And I have the graph of some of the measurements they did. So what they did was they plotted the heights of the objects they measured against the widths of the objects they measured. And in fact, you can see that there were a number of these objects which were very narrow but not very tall, and there were quite a number of these objects, which are really the trees, that were about the same width but varied in height. Here there would seem to be a different class of objects, which were bushes, and you can see these were much wider and not as high. But now they looked at this. So the first thing they did is by using the data and by plotting the data, they could see functional relationships that they couldn't see otherwise. So that's very interesting. Just by measuring things and by analyzing the measurement, in this case presenting it in a way that made a functional relationship. And what I mean by a functional relationship is some mathematical relationship between the width and the height. They were first of all able to tell that there seemed to be two classes of objects. The second thing they did, and that's even more clever, they saw that some of these very tall objects were laying down on the ground. There were some dead trees that they found that were lying down on the ground. And they saw that most of the trees were standing up. So they concluded that maybe, and also that, as you can see from here, there were a much smaller number of these objects, which we'll call trees for simplicity. So that most of these trees, there were much fewer of the trees that are small than were tall. And they found some dead trees or trees that looked funny that were lying down. So just from looking at this sequence, they concluded this might be an evolutionary sequence. That maybe trees spend only a short time being short and a much longer time in their lifetime being tall. So if we take a snapshot of the forest, we're likely only to catch a few trees that are short and a much larger number of trees that are tall. And they interpreted the trees that had fallen down after this as dead trees as the end of the sequence. So just by doing measurements, by first of all doing numbers, second of all by finding functional relationships from these numbers, they can even interpret this in an evolutionary sequence. Okay. The point of this story is that doing analysis of data or looking at the data in the right way can lead us to deep understanding of things. I think we're so used to just doing experiments and doing something and seeing what changes that cause. It's a very powerful technique that I think sometimes we forget the power of these observations, in that a lot of science emerges from doing observations, from careful looking at things, and not from hypothesis testing. And let me give some examples of this. Again, going back to these ancient Greeks, one of these people realized that when they looked at the moon during an eclipse of the Earth, that the shadow of the Earth on the moon was curved. So this is the Earth's shadow. Was curved. And so just by looking up in an eclipse, they figured the Earth must be a sphere or a circle, but more likely a sphere, because its shadow on the moon was a sphere. Now, there was no hypothesis here. No one made a hypothesis, and then they just looked, and they saw something, and it just hit you over the head when you saw it. Another example is in terms of Fleming, who was looking at cultures of bacteria that were growing in these dishes, and he was doing some experiments with the bacteria. These are highly magnified. No, actually, you can see colonies in dishes, so these don't need to be highly magnified. And one of the dishes he pulled out had a mold growing in it, and the mold seemed to be releasing a substance, and the bacterial colonies around the mold were dead. Now, sometimes you go and you do an experiment, and I know people who, if this happened in an experiment, would curse and say the bacteria were dead, they can't do the experiment, would be very upset, and throw it away. Or I know other people who might say, well, this is interesting, but this is a mold, this is fungi, and I study bacteria, and I'm not funded to study fungi, so I'm not going to do anything with this. But this wasn't what Fleming did. What Fleming did was he eventually figured out what was coming out of the mold, and eventually, in this case, was actually 20 years, and this led to the discovery of penicillin, which is not spelled correctly here, but is spelled worse on my notes. So the pen, is that it? This is not so bad. Thank you. Again, this is a result of an observation, that a lot of science happens by keeping your eyes open. The opening quotation to my book is this wonderful line by a very brilliant scientist, Louis Pasteur, that said, "Chance favors the prepared mind." In that, in a certain sense, although it seems trivial to realize if you take a dish out and there's something growing and killing the bacteria, that might be really useful to kill bacteria. But to realize something like that takes a lot more effort than you think, because experiments fail all the time. And if it's not doing what you think it is, you throw it away and you want to get it to do right. We all want things to work out right. And to be open to what is presented in front of you is a very, very difficult thing to do. And this is not as simple as it seems at all. But I just want to emphasize again that one of the aspects of science that is very important is allowing you sometimes to see these observations. It's interesting that this line from Louis Pasteur was quoted in at least 2 biographies that I read. I normally don't read biographies, but I read 2 biographies. One of the physicists, maybe the only 2 biographies I've ever read actually, the physicist Richard Feynman, and another by one of my favorite artists, who's Keith Haring. And if you don't know who Keith Haring is, I'm sure by the end of the year I'll wear at least one Keith Haring t-shirt, so you'll recognize who Keith Haring is. But he does these very stylized pictures of people with little lines indicating motion. And they're actually both the Norton Museum in West Palm and the Museum of Art in Fort Lauderdale have some of his original oil paintings. Fort Lauderdale has about 4 of them, and there's at least 1 in the Norton in their permanent collections. But in any event, both of these people quoted or were aware of this line from Louis, and I think it's a very interesting and important thing. So in some ways, I think we're very down currently in science and observations rather than just experiments, but I think this process of making observations is actually a very important one. So let me describe then the second leg of this. So we have a little bit of discussion of observations. The second leg is experiments. And I don't think I need to say much about this because I think the whole course is really about how we analyze experiments. And I think the basic idea behind an experiment, if we think we understand something, then if we change it or change the conditions, we should get some predictable result. And so a good way to find out if we understand something is to change it and to do an experiment. Now, in a certain sense, I think this is just kind of common sense. Now, I think a lot of textbooks describe experiments as we have a hypothesis, and then we test whether the hypothesis is true or false. And I think there's a lot of truth in this, but this isn't the way I do experiments. So the way I do experiments is I do them to ask questions. And then depending on the answer we get from the experiment, we learn something. And there's, I think, an attitude that if your hypothesis is proved false by the experiment, that you failed in some way. And that's not, to me, a healthy way to look at things. That the experiment should tell you something, no matter how the experiment came out. And so I like to phrase things a little bit differently. An example of what I think is a very good experiment is a very famous experiment done by Luria and Delbruck. He's the physicist, he's the biologist. Both these people have at least one Nobel Prize. I don't know if either of them has two. Delbruck was a physicist who in the 1920s thought all of quantum mechanics was done, and so they should start to do something more interesting, like figure out how life worked, and basically started biochemistry and many other things involving physics of molecules. And Salvador Luria went on to do many other very clever things in terms of evolution. And the question these people were addressing is, does evolution happen by the environment changing and then animals mutating? Or do mutations happen all along and then the environment selects some of the mutations? And this is a question that had been unresolved in biology for some time. And in the early 1940s, they did an experiment. And I won't describe the experiment at the moment, but basically they ran the experiment many times and looked at the numbers of mutant cells in the colony. And it would turn out if mutations happened all the time, the variation between the number of mutant colonies in the dish would have one form, and the variation would have a different form if mutations happened only in response to the change in environment. So if mutations happened in response to the change in environment, you would get one distribution. And if they happened all the time and were selected for, you would get a different distribution. And what they found was from the data that the mutations happened all the time and were then selected for. It actually will turn out the distribution of mutations is actually fractal. We may get to discuss a little bit of this experiment in more detail from that aspect later on. So to me, this is a wonderful experiment. You have a way of asking a question with no matter what the result is, it tells you something interesting. And to me, that's what you really want to do in an experiment, is not say, oh, I have a hypothesis, and I'm hoping it's going to turn out this way, and if it doesn't, you keep running more tests on it, which I know people who do things like that. And you don't really want to do that. I think, to me, it's nicer to be able to ask a question of the data. And this is what I do a lot in how I use theory to analyze data. We try to use the theory to formulate a way of analyzing the data that tells us something, rather than having a hypothesis that we're testing. But I use the mathematics to try to figure out a way that will be useful or efficient in analyzing the data. On the other hand, I had a discussion of this in particular of one of the ways I like to ask a particular question, and I gave a whole long explanation of this in a break in a meeting, and the guy sitting behind me was a pretty sharp guy from some drug company, basically in about 3 sentences convinced me that what I was saying was basically crap. So, and he could reformulate the same thing in terms of a testable hypothesis. But he was right, I think. So I've listed the testable hypothesis is one way of doing things. And some of what I'm saying, I think, can be reformulated in that way. But I think it has a slightly different flavor because I think people, as I say, get too focused on trying to prove their hypothesis and hoping that the next 3 experiments will do that. Okay, I think this is a good time to take a break, and we're going to get started in about 15 minutes after that.